Good evening. I am Spartacus. Welcome to the Washington, D.C. campus of Hillsdale College. This is the Alan P. Kirby Center for Constitutional Studies and Statesmanship, and I'm actually Matthew Spalding, who, among other things, I'm the Dean of the new Graduate School of Government. We are starting here in Washington, D.C., for those of you that are interested, our newest and our latest innovation. We have a very interesting conversation tonight with what I think is actually a fabulous book. The first book on the Kavanaugh hearings and his process of confirmation to the United States Supreme Court. Now, if you're like me, you watched that very closely. It was messy, it was political, it was high drama, and I was glued to it every moment of the way. Such ordeals have happened in the past confirmation hearings. I recall Robert Bork, Clarence Thomas, but there was something very different about this one. It was very interesting. There were twists and turns all along the way. I'm also used to reading political books in Washington, D.C. I love politics, and most political books aren't very good. They're mostly written by politicians getting ready for campaigns. This is not one of those books. It's written by a JD from Harvard who testifies to Congress and writes briefs for the Supreme Court, and one of the top journalists, in my opinion, in our times. And as a result, is a wonderful book, compelling narrative, and a great story, and I have to give them a lot of credit for that. So thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
Molly Hemingway is a senior journalism fellow at Hillsdale College here in Washington, D.C. She's also senior editor of The Federalist and a Fox News contributor. She received her BA from the University of Colorado at Denver. She's been a Phillips Foundation Journalism Fellow, a Lincoln Fellow at the Claremont Institute for the Study of Statesmanship and Political Philosophy, and a Pulliam Distinguished Visiting Fellow in Journalism at Hillsdale College, our main campus, the mothership in Hillsdale. She's written for numerous publications, including the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Post, Christianity Today, and she's also the author of Trump versus the Media Before Justice on Trial. Carrie Severino is Chief Counsel and Policy Director of the Judicial Crisis Network. She received a BA from Duke University, an MA from Michigan State University, and a JD from Harvard University. She's a regular guest on numerous television outlets, including MSNBC, Fox News, CNN, C-SPAN, and ABC. She has written and spoken on a wide range of judicial issues, including the constitutional limits on government, federal nomination confirmation process, and state judicial selection. She has testified before Congress on constitutional issues and briefed senators on confirmations, and does actually write regularly briefs in the United States Supreme Court. My objective tonight is to talk to them for about half the time, 30 minutes or so, and then open it up to questions, and try to draw out some things in this book, because there are, in reading it, I'm reminded of so many things going on and so many moving parts and inflection points throughout. I want to try to draw some of those out. But let me begin by asking a general question, which is, why did you write this book? It was written very fast, well done, but you had a purpose here, and what was that, and why did you do it, and why did you spend that much trouble to get it out?
Right, and before I get to that, you noted that this was written quickly. Obviously, it was 9 months ago that we finished this hearing, and it is a very thorough, it took a lot of time and research. We interviewed more than 100 people, from the president and other high-ranking people at the White House, to, throughout the Department of Justice, members of the Supreme Court, many senators, and it took a lot of time. Took a lot of reading of historical records and whatnot, and we could not have done it without actually the Kirby Center here. We had research assistants and journalism assistants that were provided to us that were of great value, and we are so appreciative of them. And in particular, I would like to just point out Alex Nestor, who helped us with some of our reporting, and Solomon Chen and Christina Skirk, who did so much so much research and help, and we are so grateful. And just having those resources provided to us, we are very appreciative of that support. This could not have been done without that level of support, and we appreciate it.
Thank you.
So we wrote this book because we knew this was really one of the most important things that happened last year. It wasn't just Brett Kavanaugh who was on trial. It was really justice itself on trial in the attacks that we saw in due process, in the attacks on the presumption of innocence. And we wanted to make sure that that was more thoroughly explored. I clerked for Justice Clarence Thomas in the Supreme Court, and so of course a lot of the attacks and the smears on Kavanaugh looked familiar to anyone, and I'm sure many people in this room saw those hearings and were reminded of Anita Hill when they came through this. But I was concerned about the next phase, and that is after Thomas was confirmed, they didn't stop the attacks then. The day he was confirmed, 2-to-1 Americans thought that Hill was less credible than Thomas. They believed him. And yet, in the ensuing decades, we've had a drumbeat of misinformation and disinformation about what went on there, and it's really tried to change the narrative. We wanted to make sure that wasn't possible with Justice Kavanaugh. We thought the best way to do that would be to get the facts out there, and so that the American people can just read them. You can make your own conclusion about what happened, and so we tried to pack as much in there as possible.
So wait, pack a lot in there is one way of putting it. There are so many different facets to this, and just reading through it, you're reminded of all these little twists and turns along the way that seemed like decades ago, but it was all compacted in such a tight timeline. Mm-hmm. And so let's kind of review that a little bit first, and then I want to ask you about what do you think were the key turning points, and what looking back, after that with a little bit of a brief amount of hindsight. What were those inflection points, and what do we learn from them, and start drawing that out? But first, let's just remind us a little bit of the overview. Your book really kind of goes through that narrative you refer to, which is actually kind of complicated.
Right. We thought we knew a lot about this because we'd both been, covering it and involved in the process. And then after we interviewed all these people, we realized we didn't know half of it. And we lay it out in a very chronological fashion. So we begin prior to the Kavanaugh being nominated. We talk about the 2016 election, which was very important for this issue because Donald Trump is running for president and doesn't have the confidence of conservative voters, particularly on the issue of judges. And then it's already bad for him, but then Justice Scalia passes away, and it's a very important issue that's at the forefront of all conservative voters' minds. So that night happens to be a debate, and he does something that hadn't been done prior, where he actually names 2 current judges who he thinks would be good nominees to the Supreme Court. And usually people would say, oh, I'm thinking about nominating someone in the mold of Thomas, but they would not get that specific. It goes over really well with his voters, and he gets this idea to come up with a list of prospective nominees. So we go through this, looking at how that list was developed. The fact that people were being vetted in a primary, before the nomination is even secured, shows just an amazing level of effort went into having good nominees. He releases the list, he updates the list. It ends up being so important that 1 in 4 of his voters say that's why they voted for him was the Supreme Court. So looking at that issue, and also why a list was important, because Republican voters had lost confidence in Republican presidents to do a good job with nominees. There had been people electing Republican presidents who promised to put good people on the court, and then when their nominee came, it would be a disappointment. So the list was important for really showing, and saying, I will only pick from this list was very important. So that was an important point. Going through the primary battle for who would eventually get this nomination for the seat that Kavanaugh now fills. But putting that list together was important because of what they were looking for. They were looking for people who had the proper judicial philosophy, and there were many, many good people there. But then they were looking for something more, which is the courage of their convictions. This came from that issue of previous Republican presidents disappointing the voter. So they wanted to see, it's not just if you have the right philosophy, but are you willing to stick to your guns when the going gets tough, when pressure comes against you? And we saw how that ended up being an important thing. In
terms of pre-setup, by the way, you also remind us of the whole discussion really before this really sets up an important aspect of it, having to do with the filibuster. Carrie, why don't you tell?
Yeah, I mean, we wanted to make sure people understood the backstory of how we came here. So we tell this story. This happened during Gorsuch's term, Gorsuch's confirmation process, when the filibuster was eliminated. Of course, the filibuster was available to block judges for a century and had never really been used against judges until the 2000s. And we talk about how the Democrats discovered this would be a great tool as a minority party to block judges. It got to be so bad that it was being used to really hamstring the president in putting nominees in the court. And when it came to Gorsuch's confirmation, it was clear that he had the votes to get confirmed, but the problem was this filibuster could allow the Democrats to force them to have 60 votes just to get to the final vote. You only need 51 votes to be confirmed, but if you need 60 votes, that means that the minority can still, if you have enough people, block a nomination. What happened with Gorsuch was the first time there was a partisan filibuster against a Supreme Court nominee, and that was because the extremists among the Democrats were really pushing them, saying, you don't care enough unless you actually do everything you can to stop him, which means filibustering him. This is one of, and we trace so many different ways that unfortunately the Democrats were really overstepping and shot themselves in the foot in a way. They overstepped to do that, and because they were so extreme, and the Republicans, even the moderate Republicans, and people who didn't want to eliminate the filibuster, who had worked hard during the Bush era not to get rid of the filibuster. People like Susan Collins, people like Lindsey Graham, John McCain, they said, this is ridiculous. If they're going to filibuster someone like Gorsuch, someone who's so qualified, so well respected, has a great judicial record, they'll do it to anyone. And so when that filibuster was mounted, there were sufficient Republicans who were just outraged with this abuse of the procedure that they changed those rules so that now a filibuster can be overcome with 51 votes, which makes it effectively the same threshold as overall approval. Now that's significant because, they showed they were strong and firm in that moment in terms of the Democrats, but it deprived them of the ability to block the next nominee. And we pointed out with the incredible stakes of this nomination, replacing a swing vote of Justice Kennedy, and with the incredible controversy that ensued, it's hard to imagine that if the filibuster had been left in place, that Kavanaugh would have been confirmed.
So that was a strategic mistake on their part.
It was one of many strategic mistakes, right. I think, that we learned.
So one thing that fascinates me in the book is you develop strategies of the two sides, and not only the high politics, but just thinking through and maneuvering and how they're going to position themselves and whatnot. Develop that out for me a little bit. Maybe start with the critics first, because what struck me is, again, you forget all these things. They're kind of going through, okay, let's perjury, and then there's a racist card, and there are all these different things before it even gets to what we mostly associate with it having to do with the accusations.
Right.
There's just a whole series of things.
Right. Well, Justice Kavanaugh used to teach a course at Harvard about the Supreme Court, and one of the things he would tell his students is the first 48 hours after a nomination is key. That's when people get an idea about who a nominee is, and you have to really think about how you're presenting. But both sides had a 48-hour strategy, I think. And so for people who were critical of Kavanaugh, they weren't even really critical of Kavanaugh so much as just critical of whoever a Trump nominee would be. So they'd already reserved space in front of the Supreme Court to have a protest within moments of his name being announced. Obviously, that was going to be done no matter who the nominee would be. And I think they created this this idea that it was unacceptable, that any Trump nominee would be unacceptable, and then they kind of worked to figure out what their strategy was going to be. They also knew that the Democrats knew they didn't have the votes, so their big strategy was about just delaying and obstructing the nomination process however they could, the confirmation process. So part of that was they had a really big fight about paperwork, and let me tell you, if you are interested in paperwork and documents, there's a chapter in there for you. And actually, we've been getting a kick out of how many people did find that interesting. We're like, okay, good,
yeah,
you
go
do
for
that.
It.
But
he had 1,287 questions.
Well, yes.
And his questionnaire and response was 6,118 pages.
Yeah.
Yes, but he had a history of paperwork that had to be dealt with. So when the Senate is considering people, they're thinking, what have you done in your past? Even though he had 300 opinions you could read to understand his judicial philosophy. They fight about his paperwork from when he had different positions in government, including when he was staff secretary at the White House, which meant he just signed off on like every single piece of paper that was in the White House for a period of time. So we're talking about millions of documents. So they fight about that so that they can delay. Their whole goal is to delay past the election. And so anything that could be done to delay, like not refusing to meet with the nominee for a long period of time, was done. And then during the hearings, they tried their continuation of this is unacceptable theme by having people get arrested and whatnot. So, and the strategy for the justice.
Right. And on the other side, we saw the justice. And again, he knew, in fact, he studied, we learned all of these previous speeches that other nominees had given to think, how do I want to present myself? And I think a lot of people knew from the get-go, and one attack that is basically lobbied against any conservative, especially a male conservative, is this person hates women. They're going to be bad for women. And so those who were watching his acceptance speech of the nomination saw he went through a lot of themes in his life of women who were influential to him. His mother, who was very early on a judge. He remembers when she went to law school as he was a child, and that was a really unique path for women in those years, of his commitment to hiring female law clerks. And that's something that a lot of people in town had noted. We had a very high-flying liberal lawyer, Lisa Blatt, who's actually the woman who's argued the most cases before the Supreme Court of any woman and has an almost unanimous win ratio. She was commenting, and this is one of the reasons she supported him, right, and spoke before him in front of the Judiciary Committee, saying how impressive it is what he has done to help promote young women's careers. So he was talking about that. And I think there were a lot of people who he then were also trying to prepare him for the hearings. We learned a lot about those meetings he was having. The Democrats were boycotting the meetings, but the Republican senators were meeting with him, and you got a little preview each time of some of the different questions, how thoroughly he prepared for those. It was like every one of them was a final exam of his life, and he really did that. And you know, the person who prepared the most, which was really interesting, of course she became important later, was Susan Collins. She had a whole additional staff she brought on. She is not a lawyer, but wanted to understand his record and did so down to the footnotes. And that was really impressive to see the kind of detail. So for this 2-hour interview, they're debating his record. So,
but the way you capture this is, let me use an analogy. You study military strategy, and you study it at great length. But everyone knows that at the moment you enter the battlefield, all the strategy is out the window. Right? There's a sense of that here. Once this gets going, it takes on, there's clearly strategy. They've clearly laid the groundwork for things. I assume a lot of things are planned ahead, and there's that going on, but there's also just a lot of chaos going on, it seems to me. Is that?
Yes and no. I'd actually say one of the things that we were probably surprised by the most was figuring out or learning that the White House actually was prepared for something like this, and that was reflected from the way they'd handled the process going well back. So even before the nominee is picked, all the shortlisters go through what is called colloquially a sex, drugs, and rock and roll interview. And this comes after the failed nomination of Douglas Ginsburg. He got in trouble for smoking weed with some of his students at Harvard. And so from that point on, all potential nominees get a pretty critical look at their record or anything that might come up. They actually had heard rumors from some more liberal political activists or judicial activists here in town that there might be a rollout of a strategy of some kind. They didn't have the particulars, but they weren't totally surprised. So when it comes out at the last minute, people who know their Supreme Court nomination history or people who just were kind of aware of politics, they weren't that surprised. They were like, we didn't know what it would be, but we knew it would be something. That's one thing. I think nobody realized how absolutely intense and excruciating the next few weeks would be. And that was more because it just seemed like up was down and reality was turned on its head. You had facts, you had things, it seemed like there's nothing here to support these allegations, but the media would present it as if there was a ton of stuff to support it. And you would have exculpatory evidence and they would ignore it. And there was this scene where the accuser, Christine Blasey Ford, names 4 witnesses who can corroborate her story. All 4 say they're unable to remember what she's talking about. And in the case of one, it's particularly noteworthy because it's her lifelong friend. And when the friend comes out and says, I'm sorry, I love my friend, but I don't know what she's talking about, it gets the briefest of mention on the news. And that's when the Kavanaughs realize, oh, wow, this is bad. Like, we thought, they hear it and they're like, oh, thank God, there's nothing, and everybody will acknowledge this. And instead, the media just kind of downplayed it and moved on as if it was no blip at all. And that's when they realized, this is scary. This is, you're not dealing with rational people here.
Are you making a comment about modern journalism?
Not the best shining moment for the media.
Right.
But in the book, you do talk about the strategy, at least on the administration's part, was more passive, I think, up to a point. It was aggressive, but there was a certain level of aggression. He wanted to be on offense, but at a certain point, it radically changed. So these kind of strategies really come into head-to-head with each other, and the thing kind of takes on a life of its own, it seems.
Yeah, there were some really interesting different strategic choices that the White House made. One that we were interested to learn is they actually, in the media, the focus was almost entirely on picking apart every aspect of Brett Kavanaugh's life, down to his yearbook, as we famously now all could probably recite all of his yearbook passages and the meaning of variant boofing and all sorts of terms. None of that attention was paid publicly to Christine Blasey Ford, but we have learned from talking with lots of people. I mean, D.C. is a small town, and there's a lot of the people that grew up in that area who still live around here. And it turns out there were a lot of stories that were very well known in the area, and people who were coming to the White House and saying the stories that we know from being there at the time, that doesn't line up with the image that we're being given of Christine Blasey Ford. They were telling stories about how she was actually much more aggressive with boys than the other girls around her, that she was, in fact, a very heavy drinker. So they were hearing all of these things, and the White House and the senators had to make a conscious and strategic decision. We're not actually going to use this, even though it does go to points in her story that would attest to that, the credibility of what she was saying. They knew that the media would be portraying it as attacking the victim if they did that. And then simultaneously, there's a kind of strategic tension within the group that's working on behalf of Kavanaugh, because, of course, as Molly mentioned, he'd worked for years in the Bush White House. He has lots of friends who were part of that community, and now he's a Trump nominee. And there was a kind of tension between these teams. Of one was called the Bushies. The people would say, "Oh, the Bushies are saying this," and they were advising a much more calm approach, kind of demure and saying, "Well, I understand, and we have to focus on respecting women," and that's all true. But I think it has to do with the approach of how one comes out. On the other team, they're going, "You were a Trump nominee," and you've got people like Don McGahn, the White House counsel, saying, "You have to remember you were a Trump nominee." And then behind the scenes, they're also preparing, thinking, we're going to have a hearing. They'd already had moots for the previous hearing where they practiced questions. This is a very different kind of thing. It's not, do you remember footnote 5 in the Supreme Court decision? How do you prepare for that? So early on, they had a moot trying to see how is he going to answer some of these questions that would come if they have a public hearing, that are really intrusive and private issues that are going to be brought up, and probably senators that are doing some in a very hostile and rude way. And they had a moot, and he, in fact, responded at that moot very strongly and firmly, and they thought, great, he sounds perfect. We don't want to over-rehearse this guy. And then they stopped. But in the intervening week, there was still these back and forth of voices of how do you approach it. And so then we had even further, America saw the Martha MacCallum interview, where the approach did seem very different and much more of the kind of calm judicial model, rather than seeing a man who's angry at being accused. And then, of course, the final very moving testimony he gave at the Senate Judiciary Committee, where you saw what we learned was actually, in many ways, what he was feeling from the first moment, but that had been building this whole time, that emotion and defending his name come out for full display.
So turn around for a moment. Let's talk about the criticism as it plays out. What do you make of all that in terms of? I mean, there were all sorts of. There was the letter, and then it turned out who wrote it, and then that testimony, and we have all these great figures like Michael Avenatti, and how much of this was, coordinated, and how much, what do you make of all that? How much of that was planned and laid out? How much of that was?
Right. So, this is all information that's kind of dripping out at the time of the hearings, but then we also learn more as part of the research. Christine Blasey Ford was the main accuser, and I think there were a number of accusers But her accusation was at least within the realm of possible. By the time you're getting to nationwide crime spree and serial gang rape cartel leader and boats off the coast, those aren't, I don't think, even though some of these things were actually mentioned by senators in their opening statements on the reopening of the hearings, I think most rational people were not taking those seriously. This was at least within the realm of possibility. A letter gets sent to the House and sent to Senator Dianne Feinstein, saying that she would like anonymity to share this information. She has this information. She does not want her name released. And what was interesting, and I just found this fascinating to actually talk with people who are going through the process. The Senate actually has a procedure in place for how to handle just this, and it's something that comes up with some frequency. And the procedure is completely discreet. It is all handled without any public sharing of information. It does protect the names of all people involved. You have both the accusation that can be investigated, again, secret, without it causing any bad problems for the person who's accusing, but you also have a chance for the person who is being accused to respond. And so it is part of the normal procedure. It's also part of the normal FBI vetting procedure. By circumventing that process, that meant that the anonymity couldn't be secured, but it also meant that once at the last minute, when it does get entered into the process, the White House and other people are constrained from sharing any details, even though you have this massive public relations campaign going on with Washington Post stories, New Yorker stories, and whatnot. And it was very frustrating to the White House. They saw, for instance, conservatives not getting it right about what this allegation was, but they couldn't even correct the record because they were sworn to secrecy if they were to follow the rules. So anyway, the letter comes out in a way very similar to what happened in the Anita Hill situation, and then that's what gets things going. But I think the people in the Senate who were aware of their confirmation history were better prepared than a lot of others. And so as they start seeing this deluge and drip, 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 they start realizing, we're just going to get this information out there. So one of the Senate Judiciary Committee staffers had learned a story from Justice Thomas that I thought was fascinating. Justice Thomas said, you know how you get a dog to stop killing your chickens? The way you do it is you take the dead chicken and you wrap it around the neck of the dog, and then the dog loses his taste for chicken. It's a pretty visceral story. So the idea with this Senate Judiciary Committee staff was, we're going to make the fact of this attempt to destroy this person's life be like that. You're going to have to wear it around your neck. If you think it's okay to take someone who's gone through all of these background investigations, who has a stellar reputation, who's top ranked by the American Bar Association for his temperament and whatnot, who's developed this with a lot of work, if you're going to try and destroy this person, we're going to make you own it. So we're not going to play the game of taking it, of what the media were doing. And they started just releasing the more and more absurd allegations so that the Democrats all of a sudden found themselves on their heels as they tried to defend what they were doing to Kavanaugh.
Yeah. And of course, many of these allegations were even in real time coming out and saying, oh, I sent this letter saying that he had raped me in a car, but it wasn't me. I just saw this somewhere else, and I thought it was really important and should be shared. Or people that had tweeted things saying they knew about, the rape vote allegation, I think was one of these, where they said, oh, I didn't realize that was for real. I mean, people were treating it as if you can just make statements about anyone because you have a political axe to grind, and that shouldn't have any consequences. One of the refrains that always bothered me that week was, we need the FBI to investigate this because there's penalties for lying to the FBI. Well, the very same statute applies to lying to the Senate Judiciary Committee. And Senator Grassley, who himself is very protective of whistleblowers, he wants to make sure people who are exposing wrongdoing are treated seriously. He had some very harsh words to say to people who, look, I've got a staff who I am taking to investigate all these claims. These are people who need to take time away from it, maybe investigating real wrongdoing, to investigate people who are making stuff up and are admitting that they are making stories up. That is a real problem. It's abuse of the process, and it's hurting true victims. And so he has a long reputation for protecting those whistleblowers. I think that was kind of the perfect person to be leading the committee at that time, because he had a staff that was dedicated to it, and they were running each of these allegations down. Several of them, in fact, have been now referred for criminal proceedings. Unfortunately, we haven't seen anything come out of that yet. I would like to see that happen, though, because people need to be held accountable for messing with the process like that. We don't want to see this encouraged in future nominations. Is
it fair to say, in your opinion, that one side was fighting in a way consistent with previous nominations, and a legal process. And another side, and a lot of the media were fighting in almost a post-legal, post-constitutional environment where it's all just politics.
I think this is what was so disheartening for so many Americans, is that they were seeing that people that they expected to care about due process and rule of law were just throwing it out the window. It was something that showed itself in different ways. And what I think about as a journalist is we have certain standards for what we have standards before we run a story about an allegation or whatnot. And these standards were kind of being cast out the window. One reporter admitted that she pushed a story that was sort of laughable. Even the New York Times had said it lacked credibility because she wanted to show a pattern. She knew it was important to show a pattern. Well, that's not more important than getting the facts right. And I think it was very frustrating to see that loss of due process. It's such an important ideal. It precedes our founding, but it's something that we all should care a great deal about. And I think that's what people found so terrifying. Actually, it's not about Brett Kavanaugh, although that was horrible to see. His wife crying and his family in tatters and whatnot. But to see what was happening to justice itself.
The whole thing. I've got tons of other questions, but I'm going to open it up and take questions. We have some microphones. What I'm going to do is I'm going to kind of keep an eye on it and try to keep them brief so we can get as many as we can in. So, Christina, we'll start right here with this fellow. And where's the other mic? Back there, okay.
First of all, I just want to say that I'm a veterinarian on Capitol Hill, and I can attest to the dead chicken story.
Fact checking.
Not really. Seriously, though, I want to thank you both for writing the book. I know it takes hours and hours of research and time from your life, from your families, so thank you very, very much for writing the book. I haven't read it yet, but I'm looking forward to reading it. Molly, I watch you every night on Fox News. Thank you for being the voice of sanity. And many of the senators who I believe disgraced themselves during the hearings are now candidates for the Democratic nomination. Do you believe, and this may be just speculation question, that the American public will remember the things that they said during the hearings?
Well, one of the ways it's important to remember is just to have an honest media who do probe these things. It's difficult when the media were part of the anti-Kavanaugh effort to have them hold people accountable for what they did. But there are so many things. I was thinking about, with Kamala Harris, we write about this in the book, about how she insinuates that Justice Kavanaugh has perjured himself. She's asking him all these questions. It's an obvious perjury trap. And the media, instead of saying that was really not okay that you did that when you didn't have evidence to support your accusation, they were writing these glowing stories about how awesome she was in the hearing that day. Or when Cory Booker is going out of his way to release committee confidential documents and has his Spartacus moment.
Right.
They don't seem to have a problem with it, so they're not going to ask tough questions now that he's running for president. But I do think that we just talked about this, about how if you make false allegations, you should be held accountable. It is important for the future, and if you care about people, that you hold people to high standards and that you hold them accountable when they do something that's wrong. And part of that is about if you make a false allegation, there should be punishment for that. There also should be political accountability, I think, for really bad, reckless behavior. And so I think it's incumbent upon voters to ultimately hold people accountable for for failing to uphold Senate decorum and processes and, again, our rule of law.
Right here, sir. Right here.
Thank you very much. What are your thoughts on the American Bar Association's withdrawing its endorsement of Brett Kavanaugh following his fallout testimony, and then later on just taking it all back because it got confirmed?
That actually didn't happen. But
we have the inside story. This is another really frustrating moment where the truth was really obscured by how it was portrayed to the American people. The American Bar Association has a separate division that does its judicial nominations. Now, the organization as a whole is undoubtedly very political. They take political positions on a number of issues. They try to keep their judicial evaluations apolitical. They are not entirely successful in doing so. There have been a lot of studies showing that they typically just empirically rate conservatives lower, rate minorities lower, rate women lower than other nominees. So there are a lot of reasons to be concerned. However, with Judge Kavanaugh, they gave him their highest rating. Then, right as all of this is coming out, there was a letter from the president of the American Bar Association, not the head of the group that does the evaluations, that was advocating for delay in the confirmation process. It was spun, and it was really, I'm sure, pitched out as a story saying the ABA is basically walking back its unanimous, well-qualified thing. There's a wonderful scene that's in our book talking about the fight in the anteroom off of the hearing chamber while Jeff Flake, Senator Flake, and Senator Coons are trying to decide, are we going to have this extra FBI hearing? It turns out simultaneously, while there's chaos deciding on that, there's also Senator Hatch who's trying to talk to the ABA saying, you need to clarify what went on here because this is being reported inaccurately. So they actually did clarify it. Of course, the clarification of the correction didn't really get the same salience as
my favorite
the first
part of this, Senator Hatch is in the bathroom,
He's in the
anteroom, trying to negotiate this, which just the whole scene is.
That's
so
because you already had Senator Flake and Senator Coons in a single phone booth with other people trying. I mean, it was complete chaos. There's dozens of people in here. There's literally senators almost came to fistfights in this room. So he probably was in the safe room over there talking to the ABA on the phone. So it did get somewhat clarified, but it wasn't really a moment of real honor for the ABA to take yet another politically motivated position on that.
Way in the back, farthest back.
Thank you. David James, really appreciate the work and everything you've done. I guess my question is what comes next? And I'm probably know where this is going, but have we hit bottom or we ain't seen nothing yet?
We thought about that, and we actually get into this in the last chapter as well. But if this is what happened when you were replacing a swing vote on the court with a nominee from a Trump nominee, just imagine how much worse it could get if you're replacing a liberal bloc justice. You know, there's that solid liberal bloc that kind of votes together. If you're replacing one of those justices with a Trump nominee, I fear what could happen. But that's what we're hopeful about. With getting out the facts, actually, we saw a difference when this all went south here at the Kavanaugh nomination. There were the people who remembered that this had kind of been done before, whether it was with Bork or Thomas or other nominees. And there were the people who, I don't know if they were young or didn't know their history or whatnot, who were totally taken by surprise. And you saw a difference in how they reacted to this playbook. And so I think it's important that people know how these things happen and know how coordinated they are, so that when, which unfortunately is probably a when and not an if, it happens again, people aren't taken by surprise and they know how to fight more effectively.
What did you learn? What would you say to looking ahead to an administration or people who might be nominated? What do we learn from this? I mean, because for a while their strategy was, well, let's appoint someone with no paper. With no paper trail. We learned something from that.
Right, and we had David Souter, who was one of the more liberal members of the board.
And Justice Kavanaugh has probably one of the longest and greatest records available to everybody. I mean, what advice do you give administration nominating, but what advice do you give, we had Judge Barrett here recently. What would you tell her or someone like that?
I think the advice you would have given someone in a previous administration would be keep your head down.
Keep your head down.
Don't
exactly.
do anything. And I think that's bad advice overall. There was a great line, I think it was Pam Carlin, who was a very liberal lawyer, and someone asked, do you think that being so out there and outspoken for your views was a good idea because now you might not be nominated for the Supreme Court? And she said, I don't think sitting on the fence is very good practice for standing up. And I think that was a good point. Like if you spend your entire life keeping your powder dry, by the time you have an opportunity to do anything, maybe your powder is all gone.
Right.
And so what was so distinguished Trump nominees as being different is he actually intentionally chose people who had a record and who had a record that he knew was going to make some people mad. And they were definitely, both Gorsuch and Kavanaugh had decisions where they were taking bold positions that were, maybe they were in dissent, but often were decisions that then later the Supreme Court advocated. So she has had a bold record already on the bench, so I'm sure she's taking that advice already. And I think it's a good recommendation. The other thing we have learned is, at this point, watching the nomination process for judges below the Supreme Court level as well, it almost doesn't matter your record. If you were nominated by President Trump, you will get probably every Democrat voting against you. So, might as well go strong and don't be afraid to take the decisions that are required legally. And that's the best kind of justice that we could hope for.
It was also interesting to us. We were very pleased to be able to interview many Supreme Court justices. And one of them said something to the effect of, there are people who are actually losing their lives for this country. There are people who have real losses that they endure on behalf of the country. And if you can't handle something like this, it's probably a good indication that you shouldn't be nominated to the court. We were struck, though, by learning that Ashley Kavanaugh had actually prayed that her husband would not get the nomination. She'd gone through 2 brutal confirmation battles previously and loved her life, and they had a good thing going. He had a lifetime appointment. She didn't want to go through this again. But when it came, she just said, this is what's going to happen, and they continue on. And so I think it's a balance, keeping things in perspective about what some people truly have sacrificed, but also making sure that your family is ready to go through what's about to come.
Over the side, right here.
From Robert Bork to Clarence Thomas to Brett Kavanaugh, are things getting worse? Is there more hyperbole, or is it just that we live in the moment and we think it's getting worse? And if it is getting worse, why?
I think it is clearly getting worse. When I was starting to talk about this confirmation, this is my job is trying to advocate for good judicial nominees. So I was going around getting people prepared, saying, this could be, here's what they're going to do. They're going to distort his record. They're going to make smears on his character. But I thought, I wanted to say rhetorically, it could be the ugliest fight we've ever seen. But I held back and I said, no, it's never going to get uglier than Justice Thomas. And it really did. The things they were accusing him of were worse, and then certainly the way it accelerated was worse. The good news is we were more prepared by having seen those, and when we go back and tell the story of the Bork nomination, and it's shocking to look in retrospect. At the time, not only were a lot of conservatives not really prepared to defend the nominee from the White House on down, because they weren't expecting the attacks from the left, they actually were intentionally not really strongly defending him. There were people like his own son who was going on TV trying to defend his father's record on the court, and who was told to stand down because that wasn't seemly. Now, unfortunately, we've realized you do have to go out if they're bringing the amount of firepower and in public relations campaigns against a nominee, we have to stand up. So I do think it's getting uglier, but I think the good news is we're also getting a little more woke to what is happening, to use the colloquialism. Instead of thinking, as often many people did even after Bork, and thought, a lot of Republicans kind of thought, oh, good, we're going back to normal. I mean, Ruth Bader Ginsburg, someone who was unabashedly very liberal, worked for the ACLU, she got almost unanimously confirmed. And so people kind of thought, we're just going to revert to our previous method. Now I think everyone realizes that's not the case. We can't just play footsie here. This is, there are people who are really working hard, and so we were more prepared going into these battles. What will happen next, and how many men and women will want to step up in the face of this. I
do think it's important for people to remember why this is happening, though. And the why is that the Supreme Court has gotten more political by virtue of how it's been ruling. And so as it behaves as a political animal, you start to see more political engagement. Now, behaving politically is actually part of sort of a liberal judicial philosophy, this idea that if the people don't vote a certain way, or a legislature doesn't act the way you wish it would, or it's not happening in the right timeline for you, you just force it through with your opinions. And so that is something that the Supreme Court kind of did to itself. We look a lot at how the senators didn't behave well, or the media didn't behave well, or whatnot. But it's also the court can do a good job by just depoliticizing its rulings. And so that is something that it was kind of comforting to see some of their rulings where they say, this year, where they're like, well, that's really a matter of politics, not for us to decide here from the bench. If they could continue that, it might decrease the need for people to behave in a political fashion.
Yeah. But Molly, isn't there another political lesson here as well? That, I mean, looking back, it's become more politicized, and we've had these confirmation battles, but I mean, a lot of those confirmation battles were lost and squandered because they didn't defend themselves. And as a result, some justices who got on that were appointed by Republicans turned out to be very different than the ones that were originally put up who got borked. I mean, how do we read this?
The judge that is
we actually need a little more politics and make the...
Well, actually, Supreme Court nominations have always been somewhat political.
Right.
Going back, and it was fun to learn the history, literally going back to when George Washington is making the his first appointments to the court. There's always going to be a political thing. The job shouldn't be political, though. Mm-hmm. The process of getting onto a court by virtue, I mean, it's a political decision. You're voting on it. How can it not be political? So, yes, you do need to engage in that politically. My point being, it isn't the high-stakes drama that it has become if the court is actually just
doing its job.
Yeah, and to clarify, that doesn't mean that you can't. So I think we've seen a rhetoric about what it means for the court to be apolitical, and I think it's actually a lot of people maybe targeting their comments at the Chief Justice, hoping he won't vote along with the conservatives, saying, "Oh, if you are a nominee of a Republican and you vote for something that is perceived as a conservative outcome, that makes you political." That's not what makes you political. What makes you political is if the reason you vote away in a case isn't based on what the legal result is, but based on what you think is going to happen politically. So if that's because you're voting with your party for political reasons or you're voting against your party for political, either way, it's a political decision. If we had judges who were actually just interpreting the text of the laws, that would mean that they're interpreting the laws that are passed by Democratic Congresses and signed by Democratic presidents, and in Republican Congresses and signed by Republican presidents, fairly and equally. It means that some of those results are going to be liberal and some conservative, and that's how it's supposed to be if you're a judge.
They call it calling balls and strikes. Right here, right front.
Thank you. My concern is also with the future. I'm not a lawyer, but my concern is with the law schools and what's coming out of the law schools. Is it really true that Yale University shut down for a day to allow their students to protest? And I read about the law professor at University of Pennsylvania, who apparently has been ostracized by her colleagues for some things she's written in the Wall Street Journal. So if this is what's happening at our top law schools, what's coming out of there as far as the encouragement to be politically active, to ignore due process, ignore the presumption of innocence? If the faculty, the staff of the schools are letting their students come down to protest.
Right. It is not a good situation. One of the things we put in the book was about Justice Kagan had a reputation for being not completely hostile to conservatives, and the way that she developed that reputation was that she literally hired three conservative faculty at her law school.
Which I think may have doubled the number of conservative faculty at a school that has like over 100 faculty. Right. I mean, it's really shocking. And she did hire like 40-some people. So that percentage made her an outlier.
And she made a big production about it because she was wanting the students to know what conservative judicial philosophy was, so that they could argue it better. If that's like a good scenario, if that's something that was commendable, it is a very bad situation. And it was very disappointing to see just the way that Yale, Brett Kavanaugh is an alum of Yale and Yale Law School, and to not care about due process again at all. Of course, colleges have a general problem with due process.
And Yale did precisely the same thing for its other alum on the court, Justice Thomas. They utterly abandoned him there. So it's unfortunately not a new phenomenon within the legal academy, but it is a problem.
You think it's getting worse?
I think actually in some ways it's getting better. Yeah. The creation of the Federalist Society has been a big support for law students having an outlet. In some cases, on law schools that are so predominantly liberal, it may be the only exposure even the liberal students get to someone having a conservative idea. They host lots of debates and have people on both sides making arguments. And I think also justices like Justice Scalia, like Justice Thomas, have really been inspirational for a new generation.
And it was actually one of these things we learned when they're putting together their list of potential nominees. They're looking for people who they were looking for people who developed their philosophy fairly early. And we learned that a lot of the people had cited what happened to Justice Thomas as the moment that made them actually care about these things. So you might have seen there are ways in which the Kavanaugh confirmation battle, yes, he won, but there are ways in which the mob attack on him was successful. But they also might have unleashed a new awakening in some younger students who say, what I just saw there was absolutely horrific, and it might inspire them to good things in the future, too.
The one thing I've seen in the public media since your book came out, I think on Tuesday, was something about how Dr. Ford scrubbed her social media before she sent that letter. Is that an important part of this book, or is that the media picking up on trivia?
No, this came out of our interviews with people. One advantage of being local here and having this story be, it's a big national story, but it's also a local story. Christine Blasey Ford grew up in this area. Her family lives here. Many people she's close to still live in this area. Brett Kavanaugh grew up here. Neil Gorsuch grew up here.
Yeah.
It's apparently a very important town. But we were able to talk to so many people who knew her, and they actually, it's interesting because it's not like an extreme thing. These are people who know her, they like her, they're friends with her on Facebook, and they just said, yeah, she had a very political Facebook, and then it all got scrubbed right before his nomination is announced. Some people did describe her as being like crazy political, like crazy anti-Trump. I don't think they meant it in a like.
How people are on Facebook.
We know people.
Unfortunately, a little crazy.
We all have people on Facebook who are one way or another, and she was viewed by her friends as having strong anti-Trump views. That did not come out in the media, even though if we're talking to so many people who know this, I'm pretty sure the Washington Post has access to the same friends and whatnot. And there was a little bit of a mention. They would kind of downplay it. They'd say, well, yeah, she has light political activism. But of course, the one story that wasn't scrubbed was something to do with those hats you wear to the marches, which I won't say the word for. She was somehow mentioned in the story about that. So actual resistance type stuff.
Mm-hmm. What was it? Speaking of all these little, the trivia and these little things, when reading through the book, I forgot about that. Oh yeah, I forgot. What was the most interesting thing that you found that was different that you didn't know about in doing all these interviews and things?
One of the things that I thought was really just an interesting, as someone who was involved in it and kind of counting votes the whole time, is one of the people. So there were a few senators that we were always, kind of not sure what they would do. Lisa Murkowski, Susan Collins, eventually, obviously, Jeff Flake, and. It was really interesting to learn kind of the backstory of how some of them had approached it. In particular, for me to learn more about Susan Collins's involvement in this. I mentioned how involved she was early on in terms of her preparation. I think if I had known how she approached these nominations, I wouldn't have been as worried in the moment. We learned things like that as soon as she saw the letter that had been sent to Senator Feinstein, that actually it raised not concerns from her, obviously, like, let's look into this, but there was a big red flag on it, and that was the date at the top of the letter, that it was sent in July, and that this is September now that she's seeing it, and why is this not going through the process? I mean, as a senator, she knows this is the correct process. And seeing how we have another a really interesting story, realizing that there was actually a conservative Republican senator who halfway through the second hearing, so when it's kind of the darkest moment, it looks like for Team Kavanaugh, had proposed to her, maybe now is the time we go to the president and suggest that he trade Kavanaugh out for a new nominee, and that she actually said, no, I think we need to hear both sides of the story before we make any decisions like that. And so the person we were worried about more actually was counseling respect for the presumption of innocence and the rule of law, and someone who we probably would have thought, oh, this guy's certainly on our team. But you never know behind the scenes, the different things you'll learn.
And I like learning about the human aspect of the story. When I was covering it, I was just thinking of these big picture issues and the actual nomination, but learning about how actual people were affected, close to home. I mentioned about Ashley Kavanaugh praying that he wouldn't get the nomination, but even right before he gets the nomination, we learn about how Justice Kavanaugh is a lector at his church. So he's reading, and he's just wearing like a coat. It is a Sunday. He's wearing a coat. He's working in his chambers, preparing for the possibility of a nomination. And he gets a call to come to the White House. And he doesn't feel like he's dressed appropriately. So he manages this surreptitious channeling of a suit, getting into his car. He actually has protection at that point from federal marshals. So a suit gets delivered into his car. His wife is rolling it up and putting it through the window, and then he's changing in the back seat. And then he has to change into another car so that nobody's following him. And just learning details like that was just like, oh, you forget these are like real people who are having like these crazy things going on a personal level too.
Yeah.
Way back, you're back there. Yeah.
I think a lot of people on the right are going to want retribution, which is not necessarily a good thing. So if we lose the the Senate and the White House, what would you say to Republicans who want to play hardball and maybe use some of these same tactics, which we're so upset about? How would you carve a path forward for avoiding that kind of thing?
I have been working on judicial nominations since 2010. So that means they've been during the Obama years when I was opposed to most of the judges nominating, during the Trump years. And one thing that I'm very proud of is that for working on Justice Kagan's nomination, for example, I very much believe, and not everyone shares this view. There's some senators who think if someone's qualified, you need to vote for them. I think no, we do need to make sure that it's someone who has a very clear judicial philosophy, that it's someone who has a record that they'll support the Constitution as it's written in the law. I think we should have a vigorous debate about their judicial record, but I also think that there shouldn't be any quarter given to the kind of smear campaigns and underhanded tactics that were used in the Kavanaugh nomination. I'm very proud that through Justice Kagan's nomination, through the nomination of Merrick Garland, which I also was working during, that none of that ever happened. And we actually have a story in Justice on Trial about how Garland was concerned when he was first nominated I'm worried people are going to maybe attack me personally. And a friend of his who was conservative said, I know these people who are working on this, and that's not going to happen, and that he was relieved to see that it didn't. So I hope that people on our side will maintain that approach. I think we need to have a fervent battle of ideas, but not let it descend into the politics of personal destruction.
I haven't read your book, but I noticed in the index you had a few references to Planned Parenthood. And I'm wondering what Planned Parenthood, what they had to do with the nomination. I presume they would oppose. And what special interest groups, what do they do to paint a particular nominee as either a villain or a saint, whatever their particular interest happens to be?
Right, and special interest groups playing a role in nominations is something that does have a long history. We particularly think of what happened with the Bork nomination, where they very effectively came together to scuttle that one. This was no different, and so I mentioned that there was that protest moments after Kavanaugh was nominated. That was a protest that had a coalition of several dozen groups, several dozen progressive groups, including abortion groups, who felt that this was important. Of course, it is important because of how our Supreme Court jurisprudence has sort of made this an issue for the court. And they began their activism even prior to the naming of Kavanaugh. One of the things that we were struck by with Susan Collins is she becomes this big player. She was actually targeted in June with hangers as sort of a veiled threat about her vote and abortion and whatnot. So this is something that people were very active. We learned about how, and this is actually public information. This wasn't, we did a lot of really good reporting, but this was just something that we were kind of surprised that they were being open about. They paid for protesters to come in from across the country. They gave them training on how to get arrested and how to disrupt hearings. And they paid their bail money and whatnot. And some of these groups were, of course, abortion groups that made this an issue and that showed in their activism.
Yeah.
I got to press you for a moment, because before you punted the first time around, but there's a serious journalism question that occurred in these hearings about how things were reported. I mean, what do you make of all that now when you look back and see we actually know what happened, we know you're knowing a lot more of the facts, and you go back and I assume in researching your book you go back and reread what the actual press actually was reporting or not reporting. What do you?
This is part of why we wrote the book, actually. We learned that there were people who were actually part of the anti-Kavanaugh effort as journalists who said, well, now I'm gonna turn into, I'm gonna write a straight book on this. And we thought, this is certainly not how it's gonna happen. And people who were involved in the process were happy to tell their story. They just didn't want to tell their story to people who had been so involved in the anti-Kavanaugh effort. It's hard to trust someone that they will take your story seriously that way. At the same time, we just wanted to tell the story as accurately as possible. While we were going through it, though, there were some pretty horrifying things that we saw, just learning different things about facts that were obscured or storylines that weren't picked up. The one thing that comes to mind is NBC News actually knew prior to the confirmation vote that Michael Avenatti's supposed second witness to the serial gang rape cartel thing was disputing how he characterized what she would say. They knew that. and they sat on that until after the vote, weeks after the vote.
Right.
I mean, there's just no journalistic defense for that. And it's, they lost so much credibility this way, and it doesn't need to be this way. You don't need, we have our views and whatnot, but you don't need to do that. You can just, the story itself is so interesting, and we owe it to all people to report, as fairly as we can.
Good. Way in the back.
As Kavanaugh has made his first couple decisions in this term, I feel like there's been a couple that have been even applauded by the left, and none that have really been really denounced that he's making some really conservative choices. How do you think those will play in the elections for Senator Collins and some of these other senators, since he hasn't been an ultra-conservative judge for the bench?
Well, I think Justice Kavanaugh at the Supreme Court has actually been the same kind of judge as he was in his 12 years in the D.C. Circuit. So, his decisions have been the same kind of thoughtful, well-written, kind of balanced pieces of work that we've seen before. Yes, he joined really a 4-justice, sometimes 5-justice liberal or conservative bloc that now is on the court. You've seen every member of the conservative justices join the liberals at one point or another this term. Justice, including Thomas. I mean, so look, if Justice Thomas is doing it, everyone's doing it. But so I think sometimes we try to draw these lines in ways that don't actually line up with some of the legal questions are really just technical legal questions that are hard to parse out. But some of the themes that were there from his time at the appeals court and continued in are several really strong decisions on religious freedom. For example, he had a great concurrence in the case about the Maryland Cross. As well as decisions, there are a few decisions, and they get into kind of the weeds in many cases of administrative law and things, but very important cases this term, pushing back on abuses of the separation of powers, trying to make sure that the legislature has its role as making laws, and that it doesn't get ceded to an overgrown administrative state. And that was a very important move of the court. And then Molly alluded to the gerrymandering decision, where the courts have been asked to more or less take a political role and almost pick political winners and losers, say when something is or isn't political enough, gerrymandering. That's a very dangerous task to ask courts to do when there is no legal standard to apply. And he was absolutely part of that majority in that case. So there have been, I think, on average, what you've seen is him carrying on in the same pattern that you have for 12 years in the court. That's why you want someone with a long record, because then you know exactly how they'll be when they're on the court. And he's continued to be a very principled justice.
But also incumbent to check people when they make apocalyptic predictions. I mean, they ran a similar he'll be awful for women game plan against Souter as they did Kavanaugh.
Right.
Yeah. And I don't think anyone would say
he voted in Planned Parenthood versus Casey to uphold Roe versus Wade. So they said he's going to be the end of abortion, and it turns out.
And we were told that Justice Kavanaugh had temperament issues that would make him unsuitable. Well, we've got a full term. I think it's worth looking back and saying who was telling the truth about these predictions and who wasn't.
And his colleagues obviously also praised his collegiality and his temperament. So some of this was just really detached.
Though we did learn that a colleague thinks that the main difference they've observed, this was a liberal justice, said that Kennedy was more inclined to do Shakespeare references and Kavanaugh is more inclined to do sports references.
You gave a very good judicial answer, but what about, how do you think this going through this nomination would affect him personally? I mean, Molly talked about the personal stories. I mean, this has had to have what kind of effects does it have? Either it's going to make him that much stronger, or does he want to, how does one, how does that affect him as a judge going forward?
Well, I think, again, when you've got someone who's been doing this job day in and day out for 12 years, I would think he doesn't want to have it change him. It's more of a matter of how can I maintain this record of principle that, you don't want to turn into a reactionary one way or the other because of a horrible process he went through. But we certainly have heard from a lot of people how much it strengthened their marriage, their family. I think, you have to grow as a person going through a situation like that tries you at every possible level.
Yeah, I'd say, I think some people would like him to have the experience make him more susceptible to, leftists, and other people would hope it would steel him even more as a conservative judge. But a wise person had said to us early on, for better or for worse, it's not going to change him. He's had that 12 years on the court. He has grown up in D.C. He already has experienced some of these things. He will continue to be exactly how he was.
Yeah.
But as I said before, I think it was just a wonderful book. You've done a wonderful, not only capturing all those facts in that narrative, but the way you put together is quite good. Do you have any final thoughts or things we've not talked about that you'd like to?
Oh, so many.
There's a lot in there, so it's just kind of it's fun. It was
about Melania Trump.
I mean, it was that. Yeah, that was a fun thing. You're doing all, again, these high-level discussions about judicial philosophy and whatnot, but you're also just learning what it was like as people went through the hearings. A lot of men who we interviewed said, you can't, don't put this on the record, but I'm going to admit I cried during Kavanaugh's testimony. I mean, and we were all like, if you all knew you all were saying
all of
it, it'd be okay.
Were tears.
But learning that Melania Trump had told her husband midway through, that woman is lying, don't you? We thought that was interesting because it's also just like what's happening in everybody's living room, and there were millions of people having this conversation, but it wasn't what you were hearing in newsrooms. Who, for some reason, I remember we had a quote from one journalist saying, like, the holes in her story actually make her more credible, and it was like, I don't think that's how it works.
Yeah, I think if there's one other person we didn't get a chance to, well, there's so many. There's so many stories of courage in this, and just a couple more that come to mind that we didn't get a chance to talk to. Rachel Mitchell is the woman who was interviewing her at the Judiciary Committee hearing. In the moment, I think a lot of people didn't really give her a lot of credit. People were hoping maybe she'd be a bulldog and jump down her throat and do some dramatic moment. And
Perry Mason moment.
Yeah, Perry Mason moment, and she'd walk out saying, no, that's it, I made it all. That's not what her job is. Her job is actually, she's a sex crimes prosecutor, but she specializes in interviewing victims, getting the information and the facts so she knows if there's a case to be brought. And after she went through this and, of course, uncovered a lot of really inconsistencies in the story, she presented those facts to the Republican senators and said, there's not only not enough facts here to convict, there's not enough facts here for a search warrant. This is a serious, this case is not well substantiated. And she actually got a standing ovation from those senators, and we learned that it was something that was very important to people who were those votes that were in play. And then the other person I think that is a great person we haven't touched on of courage is Leland Kaiser. That was, and Molly alluded to her, a friend of Christine Blasey Ford's, a liberal Democrat all her life, who simply said, I remember that summer very well, but I don't remember anything like the story you're telling me. And even later, I think, began to have issues with people pressuring her to change her story. That's a very difficult position to be put in when you're trying to be supportive of a friend, but also be faithful to the truth. And she was incredibly courageous to take the stand that she did in favor of the truth.
Did anyone refuse to talk to you?
We're actually kind of being careful about this. We did talk to a ton of people, and we're just kind of, the vast majority asked that it be on background, and so we're just kind of...
Mm-hmm. And there were some people who weren't able to for various reasons, but we actually we were so thrilled with the amount of access that we had to people at all levels on this.
It was good.
So the book, again, is Justice on Trial, The Kavanaugh Confirmation, The Future of the Supreme Court, by Molly Hemingway and Carrie Severino. Thank you very much. Thank you all for joining us. This was a wonderful conversation. So